The security guard laughed straight at him and said that the CEO's husband was standing right behind him. In that moment, Nathan Cole's world began to collapse in the quietest and most ruthless way possible. Nathan did not react right away. He stood there in the cold glass lobby of the North Bay Ledger building, holding a paper bag with a homemade lunch, the latte still warm in his hand. 1 second earlier, he had simply been a 53-year-old husband stopping by his wife's office because he worried she was working herself too hard. 1 second later, he had become a stranger, being measured with a look that was half pity and half amusement. The guard looked him up and down, then shook his head, correcting what he clearly thought was an obvious mistake. He said calmly that he saw her husband every day and that the man had just walked out moments ago, then pointed toward the revolving doors. Nathan turned around. A tall man was walking into the lobby, shoulders squared, wearing a dark gray suit that fit his solid frame perfectly. His leather shoes shone under the ceiling lights, and the metal watch on his wrist caught the reflection as he moved. He nodded to the guard with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. No badge, no questions, no hesitation. Everything about him said he was not a visitor. Owen Kerr. Nathan had heard that name many times over the past few months, always casually, always wrapped in harmless explanations. Vice President of Operations, the man who fixed problems, the right hand of senior leadership. A name repeated so often, it had faded into the background. But now, Owen stood there in this very building, being referred to as his wife's husband. The guard laughed again, pleased to have clarified the situation, saying that perhaps Nathan was confused. Nathan felt the blood drain from his ears. For a brief moment, every raw instinct surged through him, the urge to shout, to demand answers, to tear the truth out into the open. But beneath that rose something colder and sharper, the instinct of a man who had spent his life working with numbers and uncovering the truths hidden behind polished reports. He smiled. It was a polite, muted smile, just enough to avoid attention. He stepped aside like a reasonable guest. As Owen passed him, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Owen hesitated almost imperceptibly. It was not guilt, not surprise, but recognition. He knew exactly who Nathan was. Nathan nodded calmly and spoke in a steady voice, asking him to pass along some documents to Vanessa. Owen glanced at the paper bag in Nathan's hand, hesitated briefly, then put on a professional smile and said he would make sure she received them. Nothing more was said, but in that silence, a heavy truth was exchanged. One man was living another man's life, and both of them knew it. Nathan left the building in a daze. The autumn sunlight still washed over the familiar streets of Seattle. Cars moved. People talked. The city carried on unchanged. Nothing had shifted except the foundation of his 28-year marriage, torn open by a single careless sentence. He sat in his car for a long time, staring up at the glass floors where his wife's office was located. Vanessa Cole, 51 years old, chief executive officer of a fintech company worth hundreds of millions, the woman he had loved since they were young and broke and believed loyalty was automatic. Nathan was not a weak man. He ran a small forensic accounting practice, making his living by seeing through carefully crafted stories. His entire career had been built on uncovering what others tried to hide. There had only been one place he never questioned: his own home. His phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa, saying she would be late, again telling him not to wait, ending with the words, "I love you." Those words had once been his refuge. Now they felt like a blade wrapped in silk. Nathan drove home. The house by the lake was still there, quiet and full of memories. But he knew that from this moment on, he would never walk into it the same way again. Because he had just glimpsed the hidden side of a perfectly staged life. And the most dangerous thing was not the betrayal itself, but the fact that he had been underestimated. Nathan Cole did not shout or create a scene. He did one thing only. He began to observe. And when a man like Nathan begins to observe, the truth is only a matter of time. Vanessa walked into the house with her familiar smile, and in that single moment, Nathan understood that the woman standing in front of him could lie without even blinking. The door closed softly behind her, the lock turning with the same quiet sound it always made. The kitchen lights reflected off her neat work dress, her heels placed carefully by the mat. Vanessa Cole looked exactly like a wife returning home after a long day. But Nathan, leaning against the counter, was no longer seeing the same woman he had known that morning. She asked about his day, asked whether he had eaten her voice warm, and practiced the same voice that had lulled him to sleep for nearly 3 decades. Yet beneath those questions was a subtle rhythm of calculation, fast and precise. Vanessa was reading him, and she believed he had no idea. Nathan answered calmly, talking about small things, a difficult client, the lake being still that day. He slowed the pace deliberately, watching every detail, the way she removed her earrings, the way she set her keys down, the way her eyes brushed past him, and then looked away. Things he once dismissed as exhaustion now revealed themselves as rehearsed movements. He mentioned casually that he had stopped by her office that day, that he had brought her a homemade lunch and a latte, just the way she liked it. Vanessa paused just for a breath, a tiny hesitation, but to a man who had built his life on spotting discrepancies, it landed like thunder. She smiled, immediately smooth and perfectly timed. She said she had not received anything, that she had been stuck in meetings all day. She added that Owen had mentioned someone stopping by. Her words flowed easily, as if they had already been prepared. Nathan nodded and said it was fine, that he had only wanted to do something nice for her. They stood there in a kitchen that had once been a place of shared intimacy, but now felt more like a closed boardroom. Inside Vanessa's mind, thoughts moved quickly. She was used to controlling situations, to reading people, to steering conversations where she needed them to go. Nathan had always been predictable, the steady constant in her demanding world, and she believed he still was. She did not realize that Nathan was doing the opposite. He was not guiding the conversation, he was letting her reveal herself. Dinner passed in fragments, the news murmuring in the background, a missed call from the executive team. Vanessa talked about pressure from the board, about Julian, about difficult decisions ahead. Each time that name surfaced, Nathan felt another piece fall into place. Julian was not just pressure, he was above her, a larger shadow within the power structure, and Nathan began to understand that what he had witnessed in the company lobby was not an accident, but an established order. When Vanessa went upstairs to change, Nathan remained alone in the living room, looking around the house. The photos, the gifts, the memories displayed like proof of a solid marriage now looked like props. He picked up his phone and reread the message she had sent earlier, "Do not wait, love you." The words no longer felt comforting. They felt procedural, a message sent to keep everything stable, to keep him from asking questions. Vanessa returned in her nightclothes and sat beside him like she always did, resting her head on his shoulder, just long enough to maintain the image, then stood and mentioned she still had to prepare for a major company event. The gala, an important night with many people watching. Nathan said he understood, as he always did, and in that moment, Vanessa felt reassured. In her mind, Nathan was still the safe, predictable husband who would never step outside the role assigned to him. She did not realize that real power does not belong to the loudest person in the room, but to the one who listens the longest. Later, as Vanessa slept, Nathan sat alone in the dark, his thoughts no longer scattered, but sharp and cold. He did not cry. He did not rage. He made a single clear decision. He would not confront this with emotion. He would confront it with truth. And from that moment on, the man most underestimated in that house began to become the most dangerous one. The receipt slipped out of the drawer like a silent confession, and Nathan understood that the betrayal had been going on far longer than he had imagined. The morning passed in an unnatural silence. Vanessa left the house earlier than usual, kissed Nathan lightly on the cheek, her familiar perfume lingering in the air. She said she had an important meeting with the executive team and would be home very late. Her voice was gentle, precise, not a single word wasted. When the door closed behind her, Nathan stood still for a long moment, as if listening to the echo of a performance that had just ended. He decided not to go into his office. For the first time in many years, Nathan called his assistant and said he would be working from home. His voice was so calm, it surprised even him. Inside, however, a machine had begun to move. Nathan did not search in panic. He moved slowly, methodically, the way he approached a complex financial investigation. He started with the most harmless places: Vanessa's desk, neatly stacked documents, a closed laptop, nothing out of place. Too perfect. Then he opened the bottom drawer. The receipt lay there folded as if accidentally forgotten. An upscale French restaurant in Capitol Hill. Dinner for 2. Wine. Main courses. The timestamp showed evening hours the very night Vanessa had called him to describe an exhausting but promising client meeting. Nathan sat down. He remembered that call clearly. Vanessa had laughed, said everything went well, said she was proud of what she was building. At the time, Nathan had believed her. He always had. Now the thin piece of paper felt as heavy as lead. He did not stop there. He opened the credit card statements. Before he had only glanced at them casually. Vanessa earned more, she handled the finances, and he had never questioned it. But now the numbers told a different story. Lunch charges in neighborhoods far from her office gas purchases, along routes she never normally took a charge at a large bookstore, worth thousands of dollars on an afternoon. She claimed she had never left the boardroom. Nathan began mapping an invisible grid, time, locations, words, and the gaps between them. He opened Vanessa's laptop plugged in on the kitchen counter. He told himself he was only going to close it to save power, but a small notification appeared on the screen, green and quiet, like an invitation he could not ignore. A dinner reservation tonight, 7 in the evening at the Italian restaurant where Nathan had proposed to Vanessa many years ago. The reservation was under Owen's name. Nathan stopped breathing for several seconds. He scrolled down. Another entry. Coffee every Tuesday morning. Dinner every other week. Weekends marked as busy at work, while Vanessa had said she needed to stay late at the office. Small squares arranged into a parallel life, meticulous and merciless. This was not a sudden affair. This was a schedule, a habit, a relationship given priority. Nathan closed his eyes. For a moment, the pain surged like waves crashing against rock. 28 years of marriage flashed through his mind, not as warm memories, but as unanswered questions. How many late nights, how many business trips, how many evenings he had eaten alone believing it was the price of her success. Somewhere else in the city, Vanessa sat in a glass conference room, talking about growth strategy metrics and the future. She spoke smoothly and confidently, unaware that the flawless structure she had built was beginning to fracture. She believed Nathan remained her greatest blind spot, a gentle husband, content with what he had, someone who would never ask difficult questions. But Nathan Cole had stopped believing in surfaces. He took screenshots. He made notes. He did nothing impulsive. Each new discovery did not weaken him. It sharpened him. Pain became focus. Betrayal became data. As the clock moved past noon, Nathan stood up, poured himself a cup of coffee, and drank it in silence. His hands did not shake. His eyes did not panic. He was no longer just a man betrayed in marriage. He was becoming the keeper of the real story. and once the truth had been organized into order, no one in that house could underestimate his power ever again. Vanessa's car pulled into the driveway earlier than usual, and Nathan knew immediately that something about this evening did not belong to her carefully programmed routine. The door opened while daylight still lingered, and Vanessa stepped inside, looking flawless, in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Her makeup was fresh, her hair perfectly adjusted, and she was wearing the black dress she once said was far too formal for an ordinary day. Nathan took it all in during a single silent moment, and inside him scattered fragments began to fall into place. Vanessa smiled with the expression of someone who had just made a clean decision. She said she had managed to wrap things up early and thought they could go out to dinner, something spontaneous, like they used to do. Her voice was light and familiar, as if she were offering a small gift to a marriage grown predictable. If Nathan had not seen the calendar invite, if he had not read the quiet entries on her laptop, if he had not understood that evenings like this already had a place in another plan, he might have believed her. He asked softly where she wanted to eat. Vanessa named a few places sounding pleasantly enthusiastic, but her eyes did not linger on him. They dropped to her phone, her fingers moving quickly and with purpose. Nathan did not need to look to know what she was doing. She was adjusting a schedule, not for them, but for someone else. Then Vanessa looked up and let out a small breath, performing disappointment. She said she had just remembered an important call with the Asia office, something that could not be postponed, something that might run late into the night. Nathan had heard that tone hundreds of times before. It always arrived at exactly the right moment to end questions. Nathan nodded. He said it was fine. He told her to take care of her work. He would handle dinner himself. Vanessa stepped closer and rested her hand briefly on his arm, a gesture just intimate enough to keep the scene smooth. In her mind, Nathan was still the understanding man, the one who accepted, who stayed, who never pushed. She did not realize that Nathan was watching every small movement, every shift in breath. She did not realize that her perfection was becoming evidence. 20 minutes later, Vanessa returned dressed differently. Still polished, still elegant, but no longer dressed like someone preparing for a long conference call. She kissed Nathan lightly on the cheek and said she would try not to come home too late. Her familiar perfume passed by, leaving behind a hollow space. When the door closed, the house fell silent. Nathan stood still for a long time, then reached for his car keys. He did not tell himself he was following her. He did not name the act. He simply drove along a familiar route, one his instincts had pieced together from scattered details. When his car turned into the parking lot of the old Italian restaurant, his heart did not race. It only grew heavy. Vanessa's car was there. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows tables set with care silhouettes moving inside. Nathan saw Owen first. Then moments later, another figure entered, moving slowly and confidently, as if the space naturally bent around him. Julian. No words were needed, no displays of affection. The way they stood together said everything. This was not a secret affair. It was an order, a structure of power, where everyone knew their place. Nathan turned his car around before anyone could notice him. In that moment, his last fragile and irrational hope dissolved completely. There was no more doubt, no more speculation. Only the naked truth. Back home, Nathan did not turn on the lights right away. He sat in the darkness and let the feelings rise and settle. There was sadness, there was loss, but there was also something else clearer than anything before. Clarity. He stood and walked into the kitchen, opened a drawer he had never paid attention to, and there, among ordinary objects, Nathan found a strange key attached to a keychain from a luxury apartment complex. He held it for a long time. Another door was waiting to be opened, and he knew that when it finally swung open, It would not only be a marriage that collapsed. An entire life built on lies would have nowhere left to hide. The key opened a door that did not belong to Nathan's marriage, and in that instant, he understood he was stepping into another life that had existed for a very long time. The hallway was quiet, carrying the faint scent of fresh paint mixed with expensive fabric softener. Nathan stood in front of the apartment door, gripping the key tightly, as if loosening his hand might make the truth disappear. He turned it. The lock fit perfectly. No hesitation, no second attempt. The door opened softly without resistance, like a place long accustomed to the presence of the person holding the key. Inside, it was not a temporary hideout. There was no sense of haste or secrecy. It was a home, a living room carefully arranged neutral-colored sofa throw pillows in the exact style Vanessa preferred. On the table lay the latest business magazines stacked neatly. On the shelves were books Nathan himself had given her, books she had claimed she never had time to read. Nathan walked slowly each step, pressing down on a layer of distorted memory. He saw Vanessa's coat hanging beside a man's jacket, the distance between them intimate rather than incidental. On the kitchen counter, 2 coffee mugs sat side by side, one bearing the company logo, the other plain identical to the one Vanessa used at home. He stopped in front of the fireplace. Framed photos lined the mantel. Vanessa and Owen stood together at a company event, his hand resting on her back in a way that went far beyond professional courtesy. Vanessa and Julian on a beach, Nathan did not recognize, wind lifting her hair, her smile meant for someone other than the camera. In every photograph there was no place for Nathan, not a trace. A chill ran down his spine, not from jealousy, but from the realization that he had been erased from the story with deliberate precision. He stepped into the bedroom. The closet door opened, and the truth revealed itself without mercy. Vanessa's clothes were neatly arranged beside men's clothing. Her perfume sat next to another cologne, the scents blending boundaries dissolved. In the bathroom, 2 toothbrushes. A jar of expensive face cream Vanessa had once said she had finished and never replaced. Nathan sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment he imagined Vanessa here, shedding the role of CEO, shedding the role of wife, becoming someone else, entirely. Someone with a private life that did not include him. On a small desk near the window, a gray folder lay perfectly aligned. The handwritten label was unmistakable. Future plans. Nathan opened it. Inside were property listings under Julian's name, documents outlining extended vacations, notes about restructuring the company, familiar names rearranged like chess pieces. At the bottom was a legal consultation summary. The law firm's name tightened Nathan's stomach. It was the same firm that had handled their family paperwork years earlier. The language was cold and exact. Divorce strategy for high-asset individuals. Methods for framing the spouse as emotionally distant, lacking ambition, no longer compatible. Instructions on transforming betrayal into a narrative of personal growth. Nathan read every line slowly. Each sentence was not merely a plan, it was an indictment of the marriage he had believed was real. Somewhere else in the city, Vanessa was enjoying dinner under warm lights, confident everything remained under control. She believed Nathan was at home waiting as he always had. She believed the key was a minor detail, insignificant. Nathan took out his phone. His hands did not shake. He photographed everything, the documents, the rooms, the evidence of this life, this apartment, this plan, not for revenge, but so he could never be manipulated again. As he stood to leave, his eyes caught one final detail. On the kitchen counter lay a small sticky note, Vanessa's familiar handwriting. Remember to text Nathan. Do not let him suspect anything. Nathan folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. He locked the door, returning silence to the apartment. But from that moment on, Silence no longer served the liars. He stepped back into the light, carrying the truth, and for the first time since his marriage began to fracture, Nathan was no longer the one left behind. He was the one holding the entire picture. Nathan realized that the truth was not hidden in kisses or lies, but in the silent numbers that had never been questioned. The next morning he sat alone in the kitchen as pale light filtered through the window, his coffee growing cold on the table. Vanessa had left early, leaving behind her familiar scent and a hollow chill in the air. If this had only been emotional betrayal, Nathan could have stopped at the pain. But his professional instinct told him that a parallel life could not exist without leaving financial traces. He opened his own computer, not Vanessa's. This was his territory, the place where every truth had to pass through verification. Nathan began with what seemed harmless household expense reports, recurring transfers bills, labeled as shared living costs. He searched without emotion, relying on structure. Within minutes, patterns emerged, repeated payments to vendors he had never heard of. The amounts were not alarming on their own, but when arranged by month and by quarter, they formed a steady and suspicious rhythm. Nathan took a slow breath. This was not impulsive spending. This was scheduled cash flow. He opened the public corporate filings of North Bay Ledger, documents anyone could access, but few bothered to read. External partner contracts, consulting fees, subsidiary entities with innocent-sounding names, but registration addresses that repeated with unnatural consistency. Nathan marked each one carefully. Every mark represented a question waiting to be answered. Somewhere else in the city, Vanessa sat in a conference room, speaking confidently about operational efficiency and sustainable growth. She spoke of transparency, risk management, and responsibility to shareholders. She had no idea that those words were being placed beside hard numbers that did not lie. Nathan connected the expenses to the secret apartment rent utility services, all paid indirectly through intermediary companies. No invoice bore Vanessa's name. No transaction was too obvious. Yet they all flowed in the same direction, a structure familiar to anyone who had investigated fraud layers, built to disguise the final destination. He remembered Owen's confident gaze in the company lobby, remembered the way Julian entered the restaurant, as if everything had been prepared for him. These people did not just share a relationship, they shared a system. Nathan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to allow the full picture to assemble itself. Vanessa was not only living two lives. She was financing one of them with resources that were never mentioned at the family table. He went deeper. Payments rounded just enough to avoid scrutiny. Contract renewals that served no real purpose. Consulting services without detailed reports. Nathan documented everything as if preparing for a trial whose date he did not yet know. In Vanessa's mind, everything continued to run smoothly. She believed power lived in titles, boardrooms, and approving nods. She believed Nathan stood outside that world, unaware of its games. She was used to being respected at work and underestimated at home. She was wrong. Nathan did not need official authority. He had patience, he had data, and he had an advantage none of them understood. He had nothing left to lose. That afternoon, Nathan printed the first reconciliation sheets, white paper, and black ink numbers standing still like witnesses. He stacked them neatly, not to act yet, but to know that when the time came, his hands would not shake. When Vanessa came home that evening, she found Nathan as usual, calm, quiet, serving dinner, asking if she was tired. She did not see that behind his steady eyes was a detailed map of every lie she believed was buried. Night fell. Nathan stood by the window watching city lights reflect on the water. He felt pain, but alongside it, a quiet strength was taking shape. Not the power of revenge, but the power of truth that had been proven. And when truth is complete, it does not need to shout. It only needs to be placed where it belongs. Vanessa stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause, and Nathan stood in the audience realizing for the first time what it meant to be publicly erased without a single accusation spoken aloud. The North Bay Ledger Gala was held in a luxury hotel by the bay crystal lights overhead, red carpets underfoot, glasses clinking in polished harmony, a flawless display of power and success. Vanessa appeared in a stunning gown, her posture confident, her smile practiced to perfection. She was the center of the room, the image the company wanted the world to see. Nathan entered as a guest, his name printed small on the badge, like an afterthought. He did not dress to stand out, did not seek attention, yet his eyes moved slowly and sharply, taking in everything. He watched Owen walking beside Vanessa, not like a colleague, but like someone long accustomed to standing in that place. He watched Julian arrive last unhurried and assured as if the entire evening had been staged for him. As Nathan moved toward the seating area, an event staff member gently stopped him. She checked his badge and smiled politely, explaining that seating for leadership family members had been arranged on the other side. She gestured toward a table where Owen was already seated, his hand resting casually on the back of Vanessa's chair. The moment stretched painfully in Nathan's mind. No voices were raised. No one laughed. But the message was brutal and clear. He was not recognized here. Not as a husband, not as someone who belonged, just a name pushed to the margins. Nathan nodded, thanked the staff member, and walked in the direction she indicated. Inside him, an old reflex of shame stirred, then was quickly extinguished by something calmer and sharper. This was no longer personal pain. This was evidence. Vanessa took the podium and began her speech, her voice clear and confident as she spoke of achievements, vision, transparency, and business ethics. Every word was carefully chosen, every sentence polished. Nathan listened without blinking. He watched Julian standing behind her, his expression satisfied, watched Owen nod in rhythm with her words. During the intermission, Nathan lingered near the backstage area where conversations flowed without microphones or applause. He did not try to eavesdrop. He simply stood there unnoticed, and because of that fragments of quiet conversation reached him. A man's voice murmured that all expenses had been handled safely. Another mentioned that the intermediary companies had been fully cleaned. No one said Vanessa's name. They did not need to. Everyone understood their roles. A chill ran down Nathan's spine. What he had suspected at the dinner table was now confirmed under lights and music. This was not just betrayal. It was a structure, a system where power money and silence circulated together. Vanessa ended her speech to loud applause and bowed slightly in thanks. Her gaze swept the room and stopped where Nathan stood. For a fraction of a second, her smile faltered. Only a moment, but enough for Nathan to know she had seen him and understood. Inside Vanessa, a flicker of discomfort passed through her. Not fear, but irritation. She had not wanted Nathan there, not now, not in a space she controlled completely. But she quickly regained her composure, convinced he could do nothing, that his presence was insignificant. She was wrong. When the gala ended, Nathan left early. He did not wait for explanations or seek confrontation. He already had everything he needed. In the parking lot, he paused and drew in the cold night air as the humiliation faded and something else took its place: clarity. He would not confront them with words. He would not beg for truth. He would bring the truth into the light in the only language people on that stage truly understood: data, evidence, facts that could not be denied. And while those inside believed they had just concluded a perfect evening, Nathan had begun a process that could not be undone. No longer the underestimated figure in the corner of the room, he had become the one variable none of them had prepared to face. Nathan sent the file at dawn, and only hours later, the gears of a massive machine began to turn. He did not do it in anger. There were no curses, no shaking hands. Nathan sat in his small office as early light fell across papers aligned with care. Cash flows, contracts, intermediary companies. Silent numbers placed side by side like bones assembled into a complete frame. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew there would be no turning back. Nathan pressed send, not to the media, not to a rival, but to the authorities, a place where truth needs no stage. A concise, precise submission, supported by evidence strong enough to make any reader pause. He did not sign it with rage. He signed it with responsibility. Across the city, Vanessa began her morning as usual. She walked into the boardroom confident and commanding, setting the pace. She spoke about efficiency, vision, readiness for the next phase. But something in the air had shifted. A glance exchanged between executives. A call cut short. An assistant stepping in, then quietly leaving. The news did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived with a silence that lasted longer than normal. By midday, Julian's phone rang. A call from legal. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, but each question was sharp as a scalpel. Consulting contracts, vendors, recurring payments. Julian answered smoothly, yet for the first time in years, his heartbeat fell out of rhythm. Owen sensed it sooner. He saw emails requesting document preservation, meetings cancelled without explanation, a familiar name appearing on a review list. He called Vanessa, his voice low and fast, saying something was wrong. Vanessa listened, her expression unchanged, but inside a cold current ran down her spine. She did not think of Nathan at first. She thought of Leek's competitors, jealous insiders. The idea that her quiet husband could be the source of this tremor felt too absurd to register. She was used to underestimating him. That afternoon, an official email went out to North Bay Ledger leadership, requesting cooperation and information. No accusations, no conclusions, just a request. But everyone understood what it meant. A door had opened, and it would not be closed by reassurance. Nathan received the first call as dusk settled. A calm professional voice confirmed receipt of the materials and asked to clarify a few points. Nathan answered each question slowly and precisely. He added nothing, speculated about nothing. He provided only what he knew and what he could prove. When the call ended, Nathan sat still for a long time, not from fear, but from a strange sense of relief. He had carried the truth out of the shadows. The rest was no longer in his hands. At home, Vanessa returned later than usual. She set down her bag, slipped off her shoes, and saw Nathan setting the table. The familiarity of the scene felt unsettling. She asked a simple question almost casually. "What did you do today?" Nathan answered just as simply, "I worked." Vanessa looked at him a beat longer. There was nothing in his voice, nothing in his eyes, yet unease began to creep in, unnamed a sense that the order she trusted was being eroded from within. In the days that followed, pressure mounted. Calls, requests, the same questions asked from different angles. Julian began to lose his temper. Owen began to make mistakes. Vanessa began to understand this wasn't a storm that would pass on its own. Then came what she least expected. A long-standing partner paused cooperation. A contract was put under review. The first consequences of truth touched the surface of the life she controlled. Nathan observed from the outside. He did not celebrate. He did not claim victory. He simply recorded. Each reaction was data, each misstep confirmation. As night fell, Nathan stood on the balcony watching the city breathe under its lights. He knew from this moment forward there would be no easy path. There would be retaliation, blame attempts to silence him. But he also knew this: once truth is released into the light, it finds its own way. And the man once considered the least dangerous had become the one who could no longer be ignored. The divorce petition arrived on a quiet afternoon, and in that instant, Nathan understood that the truth had finally triggered a counterstrike. The envelope sat on the table like a foreign object, white paper, black ink, cold and formal language stripped of emotion. Vanessa had filed first not in panic, but in calculation. Inside the petition was a different version of their marriage, one where Nathan was portrayed as distant, unambitious, no longer able to keep pace with his wife's growth. It was a story written smoothly enough to earn nods from outsiders, logical enough to conceal every real fracture. Nathan read every line without skipping a word. He was not surprised. He had been expecting this move, because when power feels threatened, the first instinct is always to control the narrative. Across the city, Vanessa sat in her office, tension tightening behind her eyes while her voice remained steady. She believed she was reclaiming the initiative. Filing first meant shaping perception, first turning Nathan's silence into evidence, his calm into indifference. In her mind, this wasn't revenge, it was personal risk management. What she didn't realize was that Nathan was no longer playing on an emotional field. The next day, Nathan received his first call, canceling a contract. The voice on the line hesitated, offering vague reasons about shifting priorities and pressure from larger partners. Then came a second client, then a third. Rumors moved quickly in a city where relationships were tightly interwoven. Nathan's small accounting practice began to be isolated one thread at a time. This was no coincidence, and Nathan understood it clearly. It was retaliation, executed with precision, quiet and indirect. Strip a man of his work, and the story of his instability writes itself. Vanessa called that evening, her voice softer than usual, layered with practiced concern. She asked if he was all right. She said things were becoming tense, that perhaps it would be best if they talked like adults. Nathan listened and let her finish. He did not argue or accuse. When she paused, he spoke only one short sentence, saying he had received the divorce petition. On the other end of the line, Vanessa fell silent just for a moment, but long enough for Nathan to recognize that she had expected something else, confusion pleading an emotional negotiation. She received none of it. Nathan ended the call before she could say more. The following day, he met with a lawyer, not to complain, but to prepare. He brought the documents he had gathered, the money trails, the contracts, the evidence showing shared assets, funding a separate life. The lawyer studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. This was not a routine divorce. Meanwhile, the pressure continued. An email-ending cooperation from a long-standing partner. An invitation to a project quietly withdrawn. Nathan felt the tightening grip clearly, but he did not panic. He had prepared for this from the moment he sent the first file. Vanessa grew impatient. Her messages became more frequent and shorter, the tone shifting from concern to veiled warning. She mentioned reputation consequences, the idea that Nathan should think carefully before going too far. Nathan did not reply. Every reaction now would only add evidence. Inside, Vanessa's worry began to harden into anger. She could not understand why Nathan remained calm, why he did not collapse according to the script she had written. She was used to leading, used to others responding exactly as she anticipated, and for the first time in years, she was losing control of the unfolding events. That night, Nathan sat alone in his office, looking at the neatly stacked folders. He knew he was standing at the edge of two paths, one where he stayed silent and allowed himself to be slowly crushed, and another where he stepped fully into the light, regardless of what he might lose. He chose the second path, not out of hatred, but out of self-respect. And in that moment, the man once seen as the weakest in this marriage became the only one with nothing left to hide. The call came at dawn, and with a single measured sentence, the power structure Vanessa believed untouchable began to fracture. The voice on the other end was not dramatic, calm, professional. It confirmed time, place, and scope, requesting Vanessa's presence to clarify matters related to governance and conflicts of interest. No accusations, no conclusions, just a request. But to those who understood the game, that request carried immense weight. Vanessa ended the call and stood still in her office. The glass walls reflected the image of a powerful woman, yet the eyes looking back were no longer certain. She called Julian immediately. The ringing stretched. When he answered, his usually confident voice had dropped. He said everything was under review, layer by layer, detail by detail. Owen sent a brief message, a single line, stating that full data preservation had been ordered. No deletions, no edits, no delays. In Vanessa's mind, scenarios ran in parallel like complex spreadsheets. She tried to reconstruct the chain of events, the file submission partners, pulling away the divorce petition, answered by a terrifying silence. Then a name surfaced with undeniable clarity: Nathan. For the first time in years, Vanessa thought of her husband not as a background figure. She recalled his steady gaze in the kitchen, the short reply, the absence of emotion. Not weakness, but control. She had misjudged him. Meanwhile, Nathan entered a different room, not glamorous, no glass, no stage lights. Just a long table, a few chairs, and people accustomed to hearing truth without decoration. He presented everything in order. No storytelling, no speculation. Where the money moved, which decisions exceeded authority, which relationships went undisclosed. No one interrupted. They took notes. They asked questions. They cross-checked. Nathan's answers were brief, precise, verifiable. He did not need to persuade. Consistency did the work. Outside, Vanessa's world began to react. An emergency meeting was called. Board members no longer smiled politely. Questions turned direct. Why the relationship was not disclosed. Why contracts were signed this way. Why funds moved through intermediary companies. Vanessa answered with experience and language that had carried her to the top. This time the questions were not searching for emotion. They were searching for data. And data did not favor her. Julian began to pull back quietly, without explanation, just distance. Owen made a mistake in a critical report, a number off a detail missed. Small things, but at this moment, they became lethal. By afternoon, Vanessa received a temporary notice. No termination, no conclusion. But her signing authority was restricted. A supervisory committee was formed. All strategic decisions required independent review. For someone who lived by control, it was the most silent form of humiliation. She sat alone in her office as night fell. The city remained bright and loud, yet the space around her felt drained of sound. She thought of the gala, the lights, the certainty that Nathan could never reach this world. She had forgotten that real power does not always stand on a stage. Nathan returned home later than usual. He did not celebrate. He did not call anyone. He cooked a simple dinner, set the table, and sat down. Inside him was exhaustion, but not emptiness. It was the feeling of a man who had straightened his back after a long time bent. When the phone vibrated and Vanessa's name appeared, Nathan looked at the screen for a long moment, then placed it face down without answering. Not out of hatred, but because for the first time he understood he no longer needed to explain the truth to someone who had chosen not to see it. Night settled. The city quieted. And somewhere between high towers and closed rooms, the balance of power shifted. The man once considered harmless had forced an entire system to pause and look into the mirror. Vanessa stood in front of the mirror that morning, and for the first time in many years did not recognize the woman looking back at her. The reflection still showed a powerful, composed face, one accustomed to control, but beneath the flawless makeup, fine cracks had begun to spread. She adjusted her collar, took a deep breath, and focused on steadying herself. Today would be long. There would be no stage, no applause, only questions. The oversight meeting began in a sealed room under cold white lights, stripped of anything unnecessary. The people seated around the table no longer carried admiration. They carried folders, copies, timelines. Vanessa quickly understood that the most frightening thing wasn't accusation, but organized silence. No one argued. No one reacted emotionally. Each question landed like a nail driven straight into wood. Why the relationship wasn't disclosed. Why contract structures changed without documentation. Why funds moved through intermediary entities. Vanessa answered with experience with the language that had once guided hundreds of meetings. But every answer was placed beside data, and data was not persuaded. Elsewhere, Nathan entered the review room with a calm that felt almost unreal. He was plainly dressed, carried no air of importance, and brought a thin folder that felt heavy with meaning. When questioned, he answered briefly. When asked, he produced evidence. He did not argue or speculate. He let consistency speak for him. One board member asked whether he had personal motives. Nathan met the gaze directly and said he had an interest in the truth being clarified. Nothing more, nothing less. The room fell silent. The answer did not attack, it concluded. By afternoon, temporary decisions were made. No dramatic announcements, no press releases. Just limitations imposed. Roles, adjusted authority, narrowed. Vanessa signed the acknowledgments, her hand steady, but her eyes changed. She knew that from this moment on, every step would be watched. Julian did not appear. Owen sent a brief email requesting leave for personal reasons. Both withdrew in the safest way possible, leaving Vanessa at the front line of unanswered questions. When the sun set, Vanessa returned to her apartment. No one was waiting. No urgent calls came in. She sat on the sofa and looked around the space that had once been a secret refuge. Now it felt hollow, reflecting the choices made quietly, over time. She thought of Nathan not with her familiar anger, but with a slow realization. She had built her life on the assumption that he would never resist, that kindness was weakness, that silence meant consent. She had been wrong about all of it. Nathan came home when night had fully settled. He turned on the lights, the kitchen bright and familiar. He made tea, sat at the table, and allowed his body to rest. He did not feel complete relief, but he felt right, like a bone returning to place after being misaligned for too long. His phone vibrated with a long message from Vanessa. There were no threats now, no warnings, only fragmented questions mixed with belated regret. Nathan read it all and set the phone down without replying, not because he lacked an answer, but because he understood that some conversations can only happen when both sides are willing to face the truth. That night, the city outside was unusually quiet. Nathan stood by the window watching distant lights. He did not feel victorious. He felt that he had stopped in time before losing himself. Somewhere else, Vanessa lay awake beneath a white ceiling, realizing that power can shield a person from many things, but not from the consequences of choices hidden for too long. Two people, two spaces, two truths, and between them a line had been drawn, not with words, but with actions that could not be undone. The courtroom emptied in silence, and in that moment, Nathan understood that the greatest battle of his life had truly come to an end. There was no cheering, no camera flashes, only procedural nods, papers gathered, and the soft scrape of chairs against the wooden floor. Everything unfolded neatly and coldly, exactly the way a marriage spanning decades is dismantled into legal terms. Nathan straightened his jacket and did not look toward Vanessa right away, not out of avoidance, but because he no longer needed confirmation of anything. The outcome was written clearly on paper. Assets were redistributed. Funds misused were formally acknowledged. Advantages once built on silence had become burdens demanding explanation. Vanessa remained seated a moment longer. When she finally rose, her posture was still straight, but her steps lacked certainty. She looked at Nathan, her eyes no longer filled with anger or confidence, only a strange emptiness. She seemed to want to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps an explanation, but in the end, she said nothing. Some distances cannot be closed with words. Outside the courthouse, midday sunlight fell sharply on the steps. Nathan walked out and took a deep breath. He felt light not because of victory, but because the weight had finally been set down. In that moment, he was no longer the forgotten husband, no longer a supporting character in someone else's story. He was simply himself, standing firm without a role to perform. The months that followed moved slowly. Nathan downsized his old office not from failure, but because he no longer wished to chase his former pace of life. He refined his client list, fewer, more honest. The people who came to him did so not for reputation, but for trust, and to Nathan, that was worth more than any large contract. Vanessa stepped away from her executive position, not through a dramatic announcement, but through a brief, internal email. She still had a career, still had ability, but the power that once surrounded her had changed form. It no longer shielded her, it forced her to face herself. That was something no title could avoid. One quiet afternoon, Nathan moved into his new apartment. It was not large, not luxurious, but sunlight filled the rooms at exactly the angle he liked. He placed his books on the shelf, made tea, and sat down. No one called him slow. No one mistook his silence for weakness. Everything fit. At times, old memories returned, evenings of waiting brief messages, moments of convincing himself that being understanding was love. Nathan did not push them away. He let them pass like an old rain sliding off glass. They no longer defined him. What surprised Nathan most was not that he survived it all, but that he was stronger once he stopped trying to hold on to a role that had not belonged to him for a long time. He had once believed power belonged to the loudest voice in the room. Now he understood that real power belongs to the one who can stand still when the truth must be faced. Somewhere else in the city, Vanessa began again in her own way. No stage, no lights, only mornings, filled with questions about what she truly wanted and why she had chosen her former path. It was difficult but necessary, and this time there was no one standing behind her to shield her. Nathan stood on his balcony one calm evening, watching the city lights come alive. He felt no regret and no resentment, only the quiet steadiness of someone who had walked through darkness and learned to trust his own worth. If this story made you reflect, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Press like if you believe Nathan's journey deserves to be heard, and do not forget to subscribe so you do not miss the next stories about truth, self-respect, and the quiet strength of people who were once underestimated.